Neighbors laughed at the farmer until he found a lost officer and her German shepherd. The Wyoming wind has a voice. It's not something you can explain to folks who live in cities, where sound is just a mess of horns and sirens. Out here, on the plains stretching west of Laramie, the wind speaks a language older than any man. It whispers through the buffalo grass, howls down the draws, and tells stories of long winters and generations of calloused hands that have worked this very soil. I've spent 48 years listening to it, and I've learned that the land remembers everything. My name is Jim Callahan, and this ranch is my inheritance, not of money, but of dust, sweat, and a silent understanding passed down from my great-grandfather. He staked this claim when Wyoming was still a territory, and every fence post, every creaking windmill, carries a piece of his ghost and my father's after him. I'm a quiet man. The cattle and the endless sky don't require much conversation. My only real partner in this life is Scout, a German shepherd whose sable coat blends into the dry autumn grass and whose eyes hold more wisdom than most men I know. He's more than a dog. He's a living, breathing extension of the ranch itself, attuned to its rhythms in a way I can only strive for. For the better part of a year, our rhythm had developed a strange hitch. It always happened out on the North Range, near the ragged edge of Miller's Canyon. It's a place we seldom take the herd, where the land falls away into a rough, cedar-choked scar. Every time we'd ride the fence line there, Scout would break off. He'd trot to a specific spot, a thicket of stubborn greasewood clinging to the lip of the canyon, and he'd start to dig. Not the playful digging of a dog chasing a gopher, but a methodical, almost desperate scratching at the hard-packed earth. At first I'd whistle him off it. "Come on, Scout, nothing there but rocks and roots." But he'd persist, his powerful front paws sending sprays of dirt behind him, his ears cocked as if listening for a reply from deep within the ground. It became his ritual, and I suppose it became mine to watch him. Word gets around in a place like this. When you only see the same 30 or so faces at the feed store or the diner in town, your business is everybody's. Hank Miller, whose land borders mine to the east, saw me out there one afternoon, shovel in hand, indulging my dog's peculiar obsession. He'd tipped his hat back, a wry grin splitting his weathered face. "Still looking for buried treasure, Jim?" he'd called out from his truck. "Heard old Scout's got you convinced there's gold in that canyon." The laughter was good-natured mostly. They called me a dreamer, a man too much in his own head, spending more time listening to his dog than to good sense. I didn't mind. I knew my dog. Scout wasn't a fool, and his instincts had saved more than one calf from a coyote or a blizzard. If he was convinced something was under that greasewood, then something was there. I just didn't know what. Then came that morning in late October. The air had that sharp, clean bite of coming winter, and the sun was a pale wafer in a vast, blue sky. The cottonwoods along the creek bed had turned a brilliant, aching yellow. We were pushing a few stragglers back toward the main pasture when Scout did it again. He veered off, a black and tan streak against the pale grass, and headed straight for the canyon's edge. But this time was different. There was no preliminary sniffing, no tentative scratching. He hit that thicket like he'd been shot from a gun. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound I'd only ever heard when he'd cornered a rattlesnake or faced down a stray bull. His hackles were up, a rigid crest along his spine. He wasn't just digging, he was attacking the ground, his claws tearing at the soil with a fury that sent a shiver down my own spine. He refused to look at me, refused to answer my calls. His entire being was focused on that single patch of earth. Scout. "Heel!" My voice was sharp, but it was like shouting into the wind. He ignored me completely. I swung down from my horse, the old leather of the saddle creaking in protest. The air felt charged, heavy with something more than the coming cold. I walked over, my boots sinking into the loose dirt he'd already excavated. I put a hand on his back. He was trembling, a coiled spring of pure, primal intensity. "Easy, boy. What is it? What have you got?" he whined, a high, anxious sound, and clawed harder, his nails scraping against something that wasn't rock. It made a dull, leathery thud. My curiosity, once a simmering ember fanned by neighborly jokes, now roared into a full-blown fire. I left him to his work and went back to my horse, grabbing the small entrenching tool I keep strapped to my saddle for digging out stuck tires or clearing culverts. The ground was stubborn, a mix of clay and stone hardened by a century of sun and drought. But Scout had loosened the top layer. I worked alongside him, the rhythmic scrape of my shovel answering the frantic scrabble of his paws. He kept whining, nudging my arm with his wet nose as if to say, faster, deeper. About a foot down, my shovel struck the same object his claws had found. It wasn't a rock. It had give to it. I knelt, brushing the dirt away with my gloved hands. The smell of old leather and damp earth filled my nostrils. What I uncovered was a satchel, its hide cracked and stiffened with age. The stitching long since rotted away in places. It looked like it had been buried for a lifetime. But it was what was pinned to the decaying flap that made the breath catch in my throat. It was a small embroidered patch of fabric, faded to near illegibility, but still holding its shape. I could make out the outline of an eagle and the faint stripes of red, white, and blue. Pinned right through its center was a small, tarnished metal bar, an officer's rank. It was a piece of a military uniform. Scout finally stopped digging. He sat back on his haunches, panting, his intelligent eyes fixed on the thing we had unearthed together. The wind picked up, whispering through the greasewood, and for the first time, it sounded less like a story and more like a secret finally allowed to be spoken. I gently worked the satchel free from its earthen grave. It was surprisingly heavy. Right there, on the edge of the canyon, with my dog watching me, I felt a profound shift. The quiet, predictable life I knew had just been cracked wide open. The land had remembered, and Scout had been listening all along. I carried the satchel back to the house like a holy relic, Scout trotting silently at my heel, his job for the moment done. The ranch house is the same one my grandfather built, solid and unpretentious, made of timber and river stone. Inside, it smells of wood smoke, coffee, and my father's old leather armchair. I laid the satchel on the heavy oak dining table, its surface scarred with the history of 100 family meals. Carefully, I unfastened the rusted buckle. The leather groaned and threatened to crumble, but it held. The contents were packed tight, insulated from the worst of the moisture by the thick hide. There wasn't much. A small tin box fused shut with rust, a water-damaged notebook, its pages fused into a solid block of molded paper, and a single, folded piece of oilcloth. I unwrapped it with trembling fingers. Inside was a photograph, black and white, its edges curled. It showed a young woman, no older than 25, in a crisp military uniform. She had a strong jaw, determined eyes, and a confident smile that seemed out of place with the severity of her officer's cap. Standing proudly beside her, one hand resting on its head, was a magnificent German shepherd. The dog looked almost identical to Scout, the same noble head, the same alert posture. A wave of something cold and strange washed over me. It felt like looking at a ghost. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, going through the motions of my chores. I fed the stock, checked the water levels in the tanks, and mended a break in the fence along the south pasture. But my mind wasn't on the work. It was on the woman in the photograph and the uniform patch. It was WWII era. I was almost certain of it. My grandfather had served in the Pacific, and I remembered the pictures in his old footlocker. That night, after a silent dinner, I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The air up there was thick with the scent of cedar and thyme. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight. In the far corner, under a canvas tarp, was my grandmother's old steamer trunk. I hadn't opened it in 20 years. Inside, beneath layers of quilts and lace, were her memory boxes. She was the family historian, the one who saved everything. I found what I was looking for in a leather-bound photo album. The pictures were brittle, their corners yellowed, and there it was, a photograph of our ranch, taken sometime in the 1940s. A line of army trucks was parked near the old barn, and a group of soldiers, men and women, were on horseback, smiling for the camera. My grandfather, young and lean, was in the foreground. In the background, unmistakable against the familiar line of the Laramie Range, was the edge of Miller's Canyon. My grandmother had written on the back in her elegant, looping script, "Soldiers from Fort Sanders training exercise, summer 1943. They said our land was perfect for their maneuvers." Fort Sanders, the old army post, was mostly ruins now, a historical landmark just outside of town. The next morning, I left the ranch chores to my part-time hand, a good kid named Cody, and drove my pickup into Laramie. The town library had a local history section that was more of a cramped, dusty room than a proper archive, run by a woman named Mrs. Gable, who had been there since the earth cooled. "Fort Sanders during the war," she said, peering at me over her bifocals. "That was a busy time. Training, lots of movement. Most of the records are with the National Archives, but we have the old newspapers on microfilm." It took me 2 hours of scrolling through fuzzy, black-and-white pages, the whir of the machine the only sound in the room. I found plenty about war bond drives and local boys shipping out. Then, in a small column from November of 1943, I found it. The headline was discreet: "Officer missing after training exercise." The article was short on details. Captain Eleanor Manning, a promising officer with the Women's Army Corps stationed at Fort Sanders, had disappeared during a routine navigation drill in the foothills west of town. An extensive search had been conducted, but no trace of her was ever found. The article mentioned she was an expert horsewoman and was accompanied by her personal dog, a German shepherd named Shadow. The military concluded she had likely gotten lost in the rugged terrain and succumbed to the elements. Case closed. But it didn't feel closed. It felt thin, incomplete. There was a tone to the article, a sense of things left unsaid. I needed to talk to someone who remembered more than what the newspapers printed. There was only one person I could think of: Earl Peterson. Earl had worked for my grandfather and my father before finally retiring. He was 93 years old and lived in a small house in town, his body frail but his mind as sharp as a newly honed blade. I found him on his porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the world go by. He smelled of old spice and pipe tobacco. I told him about what Scout had found and showed him the photograph of Eleanor. His pale blue eyes, clouded with age, sharpened with a flicker of memory. He stared at the picture for a long time. "Eleanor Manning," he breathed, his voice a dry rasp. "Lord, I haven't thought of that name in 50 years. She was a firecracker. That one. Came from back east, some wealthy family. But she could ride and shoot better than half the men. Loved that dog of hers, Shadow. Never saw one without the other." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the distant mountains. Her disappearing. That was a strange business. The official story was that she got lost. But the whispers said something else. "What did they say, Earl?" I leaned in, keeping my voice low. "They said it wasn't an accident. There was talk of a dispute. Her family, the Mannings, they owned a piece of land out where your North Range is now. Bought it sight unseen before the war, as an investment. Old man Henderson, Bill's grandfather, claimed a piece of it, said the survey was wrong. It was getting ugly. Then Eleanor shows up in uniform, stationed right here, and starts asking questions, looking at maps. She was smart, too smart for some folks." My blood ran cold. The Henderson family. Bill Henderson, my current neighbor, was the one disputing the very same fence line where Scout had found the satchel. It was a feud that had been simmering for generations. "And there was shame in it too," Earl continued, his voice dropping even lower. "A woman officer, disappearing like that. In those days, people were quick to imagine the worst, that she'd run off with someone, disgraced herself. Her family never came to look for her. They hushed it all up, It was easier to let her be a ghost than a scandal. I drove home as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The story was bigger than I had imagined. It wasn't just about a lost soldier. It was tangled up in land, family pride, and secrets buried by time and shame. When I got back to the ranch, Scout was waiting for me on the porch. He whined and nudged my hand, his eyes fixed on me, questioning. He knew this wasn't over. I knelt and scratched him behind the ears. "You're right, boy," I murmured. "We're not done yet." He had shown me the beginning. Now he started showing me the path. Over the next few days, he seemed possessed by Eleanor's ghost. He'd lead me away from the canyon, along an old, overgrown game trail that snaked through a stand of aspen. The trail was barely visible, a faint depression in the earth that no one had used in decades. It led to the ruins of an old line cabin, a small one-room shack my great-grandfather had built for cowboys working the far pastures. It was little more than a pile of rotting logs and fieldstone now. The roof caved in, the door long gone. I'd been there before, but with Scout, I saw it differently. He didn't run around sniffing for rabbits or prairie dogs. He went straight inside the collapsed structure and began whining at a section of the floor where a few warped planks still remained. His message was clear. "Look here. The Henderson situation was getting worse. Bill Henderson had seen me poking around the old cabin from a distance, and his suspicion had curdled into outright hostility. 2 days after my visit with Earl, I found a new stake in the ground near the canyon, a bright orange flag fluttering in the wind, a good 50 yards inside my fence line, a surveyor's marker. Bill was making his move. The old feud, dormant for years, was waking up. I knew I was running out of time. I went back to the line cabin with a crowbar and a heavy flashlight. Scout sat outside, watching, a silent, furry sentinel. The floorboards were rotten, and they splintered easily under the force of the crowbar. Beneath them was nothing but packed dirt and the nests of generations of pack rats. I was about to give up when Scout let out a sharp bark and nudged my hand, pointing his nose toward the corner, under the collapsed stone of the old fireplace hearth. The space was tight, but I managed to pry one of the heavy foundation stones loose. And there it was. Tucked into a small, deliberately cleared cavity was a metal box, the kind soldiers used for ammunition or personal effects. It was rusted solid, but it was intact. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hauled it out. It was heavy, and I could hear something shifting inside. I carried it back to my workshop, the big barn, where the air smells of oil, steel, and sawdust. Scout followed me in, his claws clicking on the concrete floor. He lay down by the door, his head on his paws, watching my every move. It took me the better part of an hour, working carefully with a hammer and a cold chisel, to break the rusted lock without destroying the box itself. The lid finally groaned open. The contents were preserved perfectly. On top was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover stamped with the initials E. M. Beneath it were several stacks of letters, tied with twine, and under the letters, a linen map, carefully drawn by hand. It was a map of my North Range, my land, my home. It was rendered in meticulous detail, every draw, every creek bed, every rocky outcrop. And near the edge of Miller's Canyon, not far from the greasewood thicket, was a large hand-drawn X. Next to it was a small sketch of a massive gnarled cedar tree. I knew that tree. It was an ancient giant, a landmark on the property, struck by lightning probably 100 years ago. It lay on its side, its massive root ball ripped from the earth, a monument to the power of a Wyoming thunderstorm. I'd ridden past it 1,000 times and never given it a second thought. I opened the letters first. They were in some kind of code, a jumble of numbers and letters that made no sense. It was military correspondence. That much was clear from the letterhead, but it was encrypted. I felt a surge of frustration. I had the lockbox, but the key was still missing. Then I remembered something Earl had said about Eleanor. She was smart. She wouldn't use a standard military code for personal letters. It would be something personal, something meaningful to her. I sat in my workshop, the letters spread out before me, the silence broken only by the hum of the old freezer and Scout's steady breathing. What would she use? My grandmother's trunk. The thought came to me out of nowhere. She had kept everything. Maybe she had kept something from that summer of 1943. I went back to the attic, my footsteps echoing in the quiet house. I dug deeper into the trunk this time, past the quilts and photos, all the way to the bottom. My fingers brushed against a small, cloth-bound book. It was a copy of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. Tucked inside the front cover was a pressed wildflower and a simple inscription, "To Mary Callahan, for her kindness. May you always find the poetry in this wild land. Eleanor Manning, summer, 1943. My grandmother's name was Mary. They had been friends. I flipped through the book. Certain words and phrases were underlined faintly in pencil. I took it back down to the workshop and laid it next to one of the coded letters. The numbers in the letter were in sets of 3. For example, 24, 8 to 12. A long shot, but maybe. Page 24, line 8, word 12. My hand shook as I found the first one. Page 24, line 8, word 12 was secret. The next set of numbers translated to mission. The next, equipment. It took me the entire night, deciphering letter by letter with the old poetry book as my key. The story that emerged was astounding. Eleanor wasn't on a simple navigation exercise. She was part of a highly classified operation, testing new long-range radio equipment for spies being dropped behind enemy lines in Europe. Her mission was to ride into the most remote parts of the ranch, establish a signal, and transmit back to a listening post at the fort. The official exercise was just a cover story. But something had gone terribly wrong. One of the letters described a confrontation with another officer, a man who she suspected of being careless, of putting the entire operation at risk. The last letter was frantic, unfinished. She wrote about an accident during a late-night test, about faulty equipment, a sudden electrical fire. She mentioned her colleague had panicked, and in the ensuing chaos she was badly injured. He had left her, believing her dead or dying, to save his own career and cover up his failure. She knew she wasn't going to make it back to the fort. Alone, wounded, with only her dog for company, she had made her way to this line cabin. She had hidden her correspondence and her map, determined that the truth of her mission and her betrayal would not die with her. I finished the last letter as the first pale light of dawn crept over the plains. I was exhausted, but my mind was racing. Eleanor hadn't just gotten lost. She had been left for dead. A war hero, betrayed and forgotten, her story buried just a few miles from my own home. The final piece of the puzzle had to be at that fallen cedar tree. A storm was building in the west. The sky had turned a bruised, angry purple, and the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain and ozone. A proper Wyoming gully washer was on its way. I knew I had to move fast. If a heavy rain came, the ground around that old tree could turn into a muddy swamp, and whatever was there might be lost for good. Or worse, the Hendersons might decide today was the day to push their claim, to bring the sheriff out. I saddled my horse, Thunder, grabbed my shovel and a set of heavy chains from the barn, and whistled for Scout. He was already at the door, whining with anticipation, his body language screaming that he knew this was it. This was the final step of the journey he had started. We rode out toward the North Range, the wind tearing at my hat. The clouds scudded across the sky, and the light had an eerie yellow quality. Cattle huddled together in the draws, sensing the coming storm. By the time we reached the old fallen cedar, the first fat drops of rain were beginning to fall, splatting against the dust and the dry leather of my chaps. The tree was even bigger up close than I remembered, a dead behemoth lying on the prairie. Its root system was a tangled, monstrous claw, ripped from the earth and reaching toward the sky. Scout didn't hesitate. He ran straight to the base of the root ball, to a hollow space protected from the elements by the sheer mass of the trunk, and began to dig with that same ferocious intensity I'd seen at the canyon's edge. The ground was like concrete, packed and shielded by the roots for decades. I joined him, my shovel clanging against rocks and thick, woody roots. The rain was coming down harder now, cold and steady, plastering my hair to my forehead and soaking through my jacket. Thunder whinnied nervously, his ears twitching. "We're close, boy," I grunted, sweat and rain mixing on my face. "We're close." Then I heard it. A deep, resonant thud. Not rock, not wood, metal. I dropped to my knees, digging with my bare hands in the muddy hole Scout had created. My fingers brushed against the cold, rusted corner of a military-issue footlocker. It was wedged deep under the main root. There was no way I could lift it out on my own. I got the chains from my saddle, wrapping them around the trunk's handles and hooking the other end to the saddle horn. "Easy, Thunder, easy," I murmured, stroking his wet neck. "Pull, boy, just a steady pull." Thunder, good old honest Thunder, leaned into the weight. The leather groaned, the chains went taut, and with a great sucking sound of mud and earth releasing its grip, the trunk slid free from its grave. Just as it cleared the hole, a deafening crack of thunder split the sky, and the heavens opened up. The rain came down in a solid, blinding sheet. We got the trunk back to the barn, soaked to the bone and shivering, but with a sense of triumph that warmed me from the inside out. I used a grinder to cut through the heavy padlock. As the lid creaked open, a faint, musty smell escaped, the scent of captured time. Inside, everything was wrapped in oilcloth. A perfectly preserved officer's uniform lay on top, neatly folded. Beside it were her dog tags, Eleanor Manning, and a small tin containing her official identification papers. And at the bottom, nestled in its own oilcloth wrapping, was her journal. I spent the next hour reading, the storm raging outside providing a dramatic soundtrack to the words on the page. The journal filled in all the gaps. It told of her patriotism, her belief in the secret mission, her pride in being chosen for it. It described the growing tension with her fellow officer, a man she named only by his initials, who she felt was reckless. The final entries were heartbreaking. Written in a fading, shaky hand, she detailed the accident. It was no accident. The other officer, in a moment of panic after the radio equipment shorted out and started a small fire, had struck her, causing her to fall and hit her head on a piece of equipment. He had fled, leaving her unconscious in the remote cabin. When she came to, she knew her injuries were severe. She wrote about her loyal dog Shadow, who refused to leave her side, licking her wounds and keeping her warm. Knowing she was dying, her last act was one of meticulous preservation. She and Shadow had dragged the trunk to the fallen cedar, a place she had marked as a landmark during her mapping exercises. She buried it, a time capsule of her life and her truth. Her very last sentence was a testament to the bond I knew so well. "I am not afraid," she wrote. "Shadow is here with me. A good soldier never leaves his post, nor does a good dog." My eyes burned with unshed tears. This woman, this hero, had died alone, her honor tarnished by rumor, her sacrifice unknown. Beneath the journal, however, was one final, critical set of documents. They were legal papers, brittle with age. A deed, officially filed with Albany County in 1941, for a 200-acre parcel of land, purchased by Captain Eleanor Manning's father. The survey attached to it clearly marked the boundaries. The land in dispute with the Hendersons, the land around the canyon's edge, had belonged to the Mannings outright. And there was another document, a handwritten agreement, signed by Eleanor's father and my great-grandfather, dated 1946, after Eleanor had been officially declared dead. In it, Mr. Manning, heartbroken and unwilling to ever set foot on the land that had claimed his daughter, deeded the property to the Callahan family. He made only one request, that the Callahans act as stewards, to honor the land and the memory of the daughter he had lost. It was a gentleman's agreement, a matter of honor between two men of that era, a legal transfer that was never officially recorded because the Hendersons had already started stirring up trouble. And both families, it seemed, wanted to let the painful memories fade. This was it. This was the proof. This was my family's legacy, intertwined with hers. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet sage and pine. The next morning, as I was loading the trunk into the back of my pickup to take it to the sheriff's office, Bill Henderson's truck rumbled down my long driveway, spitting gravel. He got out, followed by his son, both of them with grim, set faces. "Callahan," Bill said, forgoing any neighborly greeting. "My surveyor finished his report. That fence line of yours is off by 100 yards. That canyon pasture is Henderson land, and I aim to take it back." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at him, then nodded toward the open doors of my barn. "Before you do that, Bill, there's something you ought to see." He was reluctant, suspicious, but he followed me in. I had laid everything out on a clean horse blanket on the floor of the barn: the uniform, the dog tags, the journal, the photographs. And right in the middle, I placed the original deed from 1941 and the handwritten agreement between his grandfather's contemporary and mine. Bill Henderson was a hard man, but he wasn't a dishonest one. He knelt, his old knees cracking, and picked up the deed. He read it, his face a stone mask. He read the agreement my great-grandfather had signed. He looked at the picture of the young, vibrant woman in uniform. His son stood behind him, silent, his own anger visibly draining away, replaced by a look of awe. For a long time, the only sound in the barn was the cooing of pigeons in the rafters. Finally, Bill put the papers down, his big, work-roughened hands gentle. He stood up slowly. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes besides animosity. I saw respect. "My grandfather told me stories," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He said there was always something not right about that piece of land, that a shadow hung over it." He shook his head. It was her shadow. He looked over at Scout, who had been sitting quietly by my side the whole time. "That's a good dog you got there, Jim." "The best," I said. Bill Henderson stuck out his hand. "The land is yours. It always was." I shook it, and just like that, a feud that had spanned 3 generations was over, washed away by the truth. The story of Captain Eleanor Manning spread through Laramie like a prairie fire. The town that had once chuckled at my solitary ways now saw me in a new light. I wasn't the eccentric dreamer digging for gold. I was the man who had listened to his dog, who had unearthed a forgotten piece of our shared history. The military was contacted, and after a full review of Eleanor's journal and letters, she was posthumously awarded the Legion of Merit for her service and sacrifice. Her name was cleared, her honor restored. We held a memorial for her at the ranch, right on the edge of the canyon where Scout had first started digging. The whole town came. A color guard from the Air Force Base in Cheyenne was there, and they fired a 3-volley salute that echoed off the canyon walls. A simple granite marker was placed among the greasewood, dedicated to Captain Eleanor Manning and her faithful German shepherd, Shadow. It told the story of their courage and loyalty. Bill Henderson and his family stood in the front row. Life on the ranch has returned to its familiar rhythm, but it's a different rhythm now. The land feels more whole, its secrets finally at peace. My future, and the future of this ranch that is my lifeblood, is secure. The whispers and the disputes are gone, replaced by a quiet respect. Sometimes, in the evening, I sit on the porch with Scout, watching the sun set over the plains. The sky turns from blue to gold, to a deep, velvety purple, and the first stars appear. The wind whispers through the cottonwoods, and I know it's still telling its stories. But now, I understand one of them a little better. I'll often look down at Scout, his head resting on my boot, his warm presence a constant source of comfort and strength. I think about the invisible lines of loyalty that connect us all. A soldier to her country, a man to his land, a dog to his person. These are the things that endure. They are the truths that sleep just beneath the surface, waiting for someone patient enough and loyal enough to dig them up. I scratch Scout behind his ears, and he leans his weight against my leg, a silent pact between us reaffirmed. He looks out at the darkening landscape, his gaze steady and sure. He's listening to the land, just as he always has. And now, so am I.